So we're going to get started with the second session, so it's a continuation of the same theme, and we're going to talk about policing, fracking and its opponents, and we're going to hear from Kevin Blow from Network for Police Monitoring UK, and from William Jackson from the John Moore University of Liverpool. I think we're going to start with a video, then we're going to have some slides, and we're going to hear from both of our panelists. And we have about an hour for the session.
I want the police to stop brutalising us. I want them to allow sunlight to peaceful protest, and I want them to stop assaulting us, and I want people to know what they're doing. So,
if what happens to these people, because I'm not prepared to stand against and be thrown about. If it happens to these people, GUERRA will just walk straight in and it'll just go on.
The vast majority of protest activity has been highly disruptive, and it tends to involve lock-ons, blocking of the road, blocking of the site, but it is not violent. And I think that is generally very much the intention of protesters, not to offer violence, not to be threatening, but to cause disruption to quadrilles activities.
some days you can go down there and it's relatively peaceful. Other days you can go down there and you are literally thrown about one sorting all day long. Some days it's both. You don't know from one day to the next what type of police or treatment you're going to get. You honestly don't know from 1 minute to the next.
If there's an element of randomness in who is arrested, it can be off-putting for people to turn up because you simply don't know if you're going to be arrested on a particular day for doing something that was allowed yesterday. And so you could...
Yeah, unfortunately, as you probably gathered, some of the voices on that film didn't quite match the people that were speaking. Unless Maria's got, her voice has got considerably deeper since the last time I saw her. Hopefully that gives at least a little bit of a flavour of the chaos that was taking place in Lancashire. But Will's going to go first, so we'll just hand over to him in a second.
Okay, so the aim of the panel is to consider the policing of protests against fracking in England, and for us to try and provide some insight into the current situation. And we think that there are a series of striking parallels between what is happening in response to fracking in England and what is happening here in relation to the No TAP movement. These parallels have already been identified by a number of activists, I think in displays of solidarity, so we'd like to just try and explore those in a little bit more detail. I want firstly to try and do that, to try and think about the response to fracking protests through the lens of pacification, before Kevin's able in a more precise way, I think, to think about some of the lessons that our experiences in the UK could bring to the No TAP struggle. So the rise of fracking in the UK in the last 10 years is really modelled on an attempt by the state to replicate the fracking boom in the US. And significant deposits of shale gas as well as onshore oil have been identified, and the attempt to explore the possibility of extraction has been encouraged by governments in the last 10 years, since 2007. The potential revenues from fracking in England in particular are significant, and they've been sufficient to encourage the development of an onshore oil and gas industry, which has been encouraged by the state through a range of tax breaks and incentives to encourage investment. But it's at these new frontiers where the industry has met resistance in the UK as it has elsewhere. So we've seen in the UK new coalitions of local communities along with more established climate and social justice campaigns who've come together and focused on the risks of environmental degradation which are seemingly inherent in fracking. Campaigners have pointed, obviously, to the real impacts already documented in other parts of the world, and opposition has focused on the potential for land, air and water pollution, seismic instability, as well as the much broader issue of relying on fossil fuels in the face of climate change. So in the UK, the campaigns have begun, in many cases, from a local focus, but then have become linked through their struggles against the further privatisation and depletion of the environmental commons. So opposition to fracking is seemingly ubiquitous, right? So we see opposition to fracking everywhere that fracking is developed in Europe and beyond, but the capacity of opposition movements to effectively disrupt is arguably dependent on the political and legal context in which fracking develops. And I think this gives us a sense or a potential to think through fracking through the lens of pacification. So as Mark has explained, pacification has historically involved the production of docile bodies. It's what pacification allows us to think through, this productive potential, productive dynamic to state power that involves producing the right types of subjects fit for capitalism. So pacification in both colonial settings and elsewhere has involved this creative application of power, and I think this allows us to think through what's going on in response to struggle. So the response to struggles in relation to fracking, like struggles more generally, are inevitably defined as disorderly, regardless of the form that they take, and that's what I want to explore. But pacification is never a finished project. It is confronted by, shaped by, and ultimately limited by struggle. The exercise of police power in response to protest and its seemingly inherent violence has to be understood as having both destructive and productive dimensions. So when we look at what's going on in the UK, the suppression of a protest march or a protest action is important. This is important in terms of why the police have been deployed. And we see this in response to protests against war, austerity, educational policies, etc. in the UK, as we have here as well. But the aim is also to produce a responsible, peaceful, legitimate form of protester that is ultimately a disciplined political subject who doesn't seek to disrupt. And this has been reflected in the UK in specific reference to anti-fracking protests. We see in the context of fracking an attempt by police to define what legitimate types of protests, what that actually means. So if I can get this to kind of tab down. I don't know if you can see, I'll try and just explain what these diagrams mean. This is taken from current UK police policy in relation to fracking protests. And this is how police publicly explain who is involved in protest. So you have a hierarchy where people at the bottom have passive support or opposition for fracking. There are people involved in what's referred to as protest, which is peaceful and legal, but then there are groups of people who are involved in what the police refer to as activism, which is defined by criminality. If you're an activist, you are involved in criminality. And then at the top of the hierarchy is extremists, who are involved in serious criminality, and we could speak to that a little bit more in the session. But basically what this means when you drill down into this further is that direct action, any form of positive action to oppose fracking, is defined as illegitimate. It's defined as unacceptable, and we can see this in a second diagram produced in the UK by the College of Policing, who are the organisation responsible for training and professional standards in police. So to explain for people where the distinction is drawn, you can see the dotted line. There's a distinction between those people involved in protests, which is acceptable, and those people involved in activism, which is unacceptable, and the distinction is based on what people aim to do rather than their particular actions. So protest is someone who stands somewhere, shouts things, waves a banner. Activists are people who believe in social and political change and work to make that happen. That's the distinction. It isn't based around violence, it's based around an attempt to effect substantive change. And these ideas maybe don't surprise us, but they've developed specifically in recent years in relation to fracking protests. Essentially, fracking is the sharp end of the development of police ideas about what is possible and what should be possible. So we've seen in relation to fracking the use of violent policing which has been justified as a proportionate response to quote-unquote violent protests. Fracking protests are invariably defined as violent. Now, this doesn't involve violence against the person or even violence against property. It's about what the opposition to fracking represents. So the anti-fracking movement in the UK, as elsewhere, has a universal commitment to peaceful, non-violent protests. But there is also a clear aim to disrupt, to delay, and ultimately to defeat this developing industry. Now, as in a direct parallel with what speakers yesterday and today have referred to in response to No TAP, what we end up with is a situation where, as Elena explained yesterday, just by being involved in opposition, you are defined as a dangerous individual. And we see that very clearly in both contexts, I think. So the emphasis by police on the violence or the apparent violence and criminality of the protest is their attempt to reproduce the suitably docile, acceptable protester. Those on the peripheries of the movement, either physically on the edges or ideologically on the peripheries of a movement, are arguably as much a target of this policing as those people directly involved. So we see spectacular displays of police brutality, sexualized violence against women protesters by police, the kettling of groups, arresting children, women and the elderly, all essentially seek to demonstrate to people that protest in this context is inherently illegitimate and dangerous. Now, this attempted construction of acceptable protests in the police vision has been informed in recent years by the use of a series of legal injunctions at protest sites around England. Now, police have been involved in actively encouraging fracking companies to take out civil injunctions that prohibit what in many cases are otherwise legal forms of protest from a particular geographical area. These have been increasingly prevalent at sites around the country and are now one of the key tools utilised by the industry to tackle protests. So to give you some indication of what we're looking at in the UK, it's difficult to see, but the blue areas represent significant deposits either of shale gas or of tight oil. So these are the unconventional fossil fuel reserves. Down the bottom, I tried to give you a sense of the scale of the reserves, both in the north of England and the south of England, southeast of England, are significant reserves of shale gas in the north and tight oil in the south. So these are things to make investors excited enough to really want to push this industry forward. Now, Preston New Road, which is a site in the northwest of England, has an injunction which prohibits trespass on the site and on neighbouring farmland, as well as prohibiting unlawful obstruction of entrance to the drill site. It also prohibits the unlawful disruption of suppliers to the drill site, so the attempt here is to defend supply chains, along with the obstruction of the site entrance, which has been a favoured tactic of protesters at this site and many others. So basically what these injunctions do is list all the forms of direct action that the anti-fracking movement has used at sites around the country. Essentially, direct action tactics have been prohibited, and those who breach these injunctions can be found in contempt of court, and this can lead to imprisonment, fines, or the seizure of assets. Now, the use of these injunctions are a reflection of the tenacity of anti-fracking protests in England, which have endured over the last 5 years. They are essentially a reflection of the success of the movement and the failure of naked police power to be enough to drive out the movement. The industry have stated in their words, to quote them, that the injunctions do not prevent the rights to freedom of assembly or expression, and they said that, quote, those who wish to express their views peacefully and lawfully outside our sites will be free to do so. Importantly, this is what protest is becoming, is in the police and industry image is what protest is limited to. It is limited to a symbolic register of opposition, to the waving of a banner, the shouting of slogans. Any form of disruption is prohibited. So the peaceful protests limited or sanctioned by these injunctions are those which do not seek to disrupt. Essentially what we see is through the law, the legitimate protester is being continuously reimagined, and the parameters within which protests can take place are increasingly narrowed. We've seen these injunctions used against opponents to major infrastructure projects like new high-speed rail link in England, as well as protests against tree felling and onshore oil drilling. This is seemingly a tactic encouraged by police that has been adopted by state and capital. So we see here, in response to environmental activism, the law's productive capacity as it seeks to in the drive to produce the ideal protester. Now, UK Oil and Gas, who are one of the companies responsible for fracking at the moment, or are seeking to be involved, they use these injunctions to defeat protest in their view. They've tried also to encourage, and I'll give you a few things they want to add to these injunctions, all those people who encourage protest against fossil fuels, those who behave in a threatening or intimidating or abusive manner, including making threatening or abusive electronic communications, and those involved in watching or besetting a fracking site. Now, at the moment, those additional conditions were thrown out by the High Court, but they give us a sense where the industry, with police and government backing, are trying to go. They cut to the heart of pacification and the exercise of police power in the interests of capital. Now, the emphasis on besetting is interesting because that is an offence which involves successfully preventing someone going about their legal work, which is essentially what anti-fracking and protests against tree felling are attempting to do. Now, just to kind of come to a close, I wanted to make reference to this gentleman who is Stephen Sanderson, who is the chief executive of the UK Oil and Gas Company. And he suggests that these injunctions uphold the company's collective human, legal and democratic right to conduct their lawful business. That the aim of what he's doing with the support of police is to reshape the legal status of non-violent direct action protest. The fundamental concern for these people is collective action. And we see this in relation to the 3 anti-fracking protesters who were imprisoned for up to 16 months last week for the crime of public nuisance following direct action protests in the north of England. The industry, Sanderson particularly, with his little helmet on, have described collective action as mob rule. Interestingly, as Mark explained in the fabrication of social order, the idea of the mob is an abbreviation of the Latin term developed by the ruling class in the 18th century as a coda for the poor, and thus the emerging working class and the lower order. So it's no surprise that the industry draw upon the same language now to describe the same threats to capital. So when Stephen Sanderson refers to mob rule and anarchy, what he's essentially talking about are peaceful forms of direct action protest. So anti-fracking protests, therefore, constitute a clear sign of disorder. They symbolise an opposition to state corporate collusion in the economic exploitation of the natural environment. And it's this disorderly nature of the protest, not to suggest that the protests are run in a disorderly fashion, but it's this that gives rise to the policing response. We have to be careful not to imagine or envisage this as being something which is radically new. It is not evidence of a significant shift in the role of police. So just to conclude then, the recent developments in response in the UK are a reflection of the effectiveness of organised collective community responses. The pacification process in this sense is not complete and is shaped by those struggles that reject the image of the docile political subject which is produced by state and capital. And I think we see parallels, therefore, in between what is happening in the UK and what is happening here. And I think Kevin can speak a little bit more about that now.